Now, mainly when we're looking at the increase in infectious disease infections on people and populations, we're talking about extreme weather events. Now, these, of course, are increasing very rapidly. The IPCC says they are, that they're human caused, and that they're going to continue to increase. So these events, torrential rain, heat, and damage to infrastructure, these all result in increased exposure to the common infectious diseases that we all know about around the world.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmons, author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, and I'll be your host today. You can't avoid the headlines everywhere about disease. Right now, it's hantavirus, it's Ebola. Next month, it may be something else. This is part of the world in which we live. And I think most of us, as those focused on climate change, know that there's some kind of connection, not always entirely clear, between disease, particularly infectious disease, and climate change. And that is the focus of our program today. What is the relationship? What do we know? What don't we know? And what is likely to happen? What is possible to happen with respect to disease and the accelerating climate crisis in the months and the years ahead? We have with us, as always, our two regular panelists, Peter Carter. Dr. Peter Carter, you are a retired medical doctor from British Columbia. You're the head of the Climate Emergency Institute that you founded, and you're a former IPCC expert reviewer. And we have Paul Beckwith, climate system scientist who lives in Ottawa, Canada, has taught at Ottawa area universities, and is the host of a very popular and prolific YouTube program on every aspect of the climate crisis. And as always, please stay until the end of the program when I'll be presenting in less than 3 minutes three of the biggest climate stories of the week, what we call our Climate Three. And as always, please like this program, subscribe to our channel, go to our website, climateemergencyforum.org. Your donations would be greatly appreciated. And please leave us your comments, leave us your suggestions for future programs, and tell your folks and the people in your lives about our program. And also, one new thing, we now have podcasts. So please take a look on the YouTube page and our website so you will see this additional way to learn all about the Climate Emergency Forum. With that, let me turn it over to, appropriately, a doctor, Dr. Peter Carter. Peter, I know you've thought about this issue, you've written about this issue, you follow this issue closely. Give us your initial perspective on the connection between infectious disease and the climate crisis.
Yeah, okay, Herb, thank you. Yeah, indeed. I mean, I was horrified that it was about 20 years ago, this is so many years ago, that I recall very, very well going to a climate change conference, and there was one of the world's top infectious disease experts there. And he said, we better assume that most, if not all, infectious diseases and vector-borne diseases are going to be increased by global warming because it was global warming back there. And indeed, we have known about this connection for years and years and years. The 1995 IPCC report had it. They had a chart, a really good chart of impacts of global warming, and there was infectious diseases that they said would be affected in an adverse way. Now, mainly when we're looking at the increase in infectious disease infections on people and populations, we're talking about, or we're looking at extreme weather events. Now, these, of course, are increasing very rapidly. The IPCC says they are, that they're human caused, and that they're going to continue to increase. So these events, rain, torrential rain, I should say, heat, and damage to infrastructure. These all result in increased exposure to the common infectious diseases that we all know about around the world. With respect to the infrastructure relationship, of course, this affects the poorer countries much, much worse. Now, wading through the literature, even today, most of it is looking at the well-known risks and increasing the risks of multiple risks of climate change to infectious diseases. So I was very glad that the IPCC assessment came down very solidly on this. So this assessment said that the occurrence of climate-related foodborne and waterborne diseases has increased. There's a lot of confusion about whether these things have increased or not. So this is IPCC saying they have. The incidence of vector-borne diseases, mosquitoes and those ticks and things, has increased from range expansion and increased reproduction of vector diseases. Animal and human diseases, including zoonoses, are emerging in new areas. Now, there's quite a lot of science publication on what they're calling a spillover effect of as populations increase, global warming increases, there's a greater risk of us contracting diseases from other animals. So water and foodborne disease risks have increased regionally from climate-sensitive aquatic waterborne pathogens, and that includes Vibrio, and of course, cholera is one of the Vibrios. Toxic substances from harmful freshwater cyanobacteria have increased. Higher temperatures, increased rain and flooding have increased the occurrence of diarrheal disease, although one of the very good news is about our international public health system is the infantile diarrheal diseases, which was a terrible killer. That's been reduced dramatically. And on the increased occurrence, the IPCC is including cholera and other gastrointestinal infections, and that's regionally at this stage, not globally. The IPCC also gives us data on geographic recurrences. In the case of dengue, which is a vector-borne disease, that has increased globally, and it's increasing fast. This was the one that was most definitely predicted to increase. Chikungunya virus in Asia, Latin America, North America, and Europe, they're increasing. Lyme disease is probably well known that that's increasing in North America. Tick-borne encephalitis, another nasty vector that's increasing in Europe. So there's quite a bit there from the IPCC. A recent paper by Camilo Mora. Camilo Mora does research on human population effects of climate change, and he's tremendous. So he published in 2022 that, listen to this, over half of known human pathogenic disease can be aggravated by climate change. And as usual, the paper is comprehensive and absolutely superb. He concludes that the sheer number of pathogenic diseases and transmission pathways aggravated by climate hazards reveals the magnitude of the human health threat of climate change and the urgent need for aggressive actions on greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you, Peter. You've given us such a catalog of scary sounding and appropriately scary sounding diseases. I hope our viewers won't turn to another channel because we'll be talking about what we can do to help prevent and minimize the spread of those diseases later on in this program. But thanks for that, Peter. Paul, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Peter, and thanks, Herb. I'll talk about some of the actual physical mechanisms, how, warming and rainfall can increase people's exposure to these viruses and bacteria and diseases. But, one thing that just came to mind is part of the increase in the diseases that people are getting could be actually due to, we know there's a lot of obesity around the world. That leads to general suppression of immune systems and people being more vulnerable to pick up things. And when they do pick up things, they might not recover as quickly. So, the heat waves that stress our bodies, incredible storms, having many people evacuated, tropical storms that go through and soak entire regions, those things can lead to environments that carry a lot more disease as well. So there's that part of it. In terms of, the extreme weather events, we can talk about droughts, for example, in a region will cause a lot of vegetation to die. And things that carry diseases like mice or other rodents would have to then migrate to regions, whether that be a city or whether that be a region where there's more contact with humans. So the simple probability of transferal of diseases could be larger. Also, if there's torrential rainfalls in regions leading to floods, I've already talked about the problem of the floods from, say, tropical storms, but also from floods from torrential rain, then that results in a great increase also of plant growth in those regions of grasses and shrubs and things like that, and therefore a great increase in, again, in rodent populations, for example. So the population numbers can go way up, and then the probability that they're carrying something that's detrimental to humans is on the rise. Many people, are still talking about something loosely called long COVID. A lot of people around the world had detrimental health from COVID, and there's still long-term effects of that. And that would increase the vulnerability of people as well to catching some of these diseases. So Peter's talked about a number of different papers. I just want to mention the Lancet, very well-known, important medical journal. So in 2009, in the Lancet, they called climate change the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. In a 2025 articles in Lancet, they said climate change was responsible for millions of excess deaths per year that wouldn't have occurred in the absence of that climate change. Heat waves were about 500,000 of that, but a lot of these other things, they're not direct effects. There can be secondary or tertiary effects due to increasing the probability of humans being exposed to diseases that are in other animal populations. And I just want to end by saying, a much warmer world, the tropics expands. Generally, the vast majority of the population lives at higher latitudes. We often take trips, if people take trips to near tropical regions, plus or minus 10 or 20 degrees in latitude from the equator, we know pretty well that there's lots more probability of catching diseases in temperate regions than there are in colder, higher latitude regions. So, as the latitude bands of the tropics expands, that encompasses more and more people and would expose people to diseases that they didn't have to worry about before in a cooler world.
Thanks, Paul. And I appreciate that you brought in other factors. Climate change is one dimension, and obviously an accelerating dimension and an increasingly important dimension of disease, food, as you pointed out, obesity, poor diets, poor housing, stress, toxic chemicals, you name it. All these things affect our immune systems and our ability to respond to the whole range of pathogens that are out there. So I wanted to ask both of you for a couple of minutes. Many people may not be aware that the statistics I've seen show that something like 5 to 10 times as many people die from or related to cold weather as they do to hot weather. What are the implications of a warming world in terms of that current reality that for a variety of reasons, respiratory viruses pass more easily, cardiovascular disease is more prevalent, people are more subject to it in cold weather, their arteries constrict and things like that. Peter, let me start with you. How does climate change and cold weather interact? And is there I don't ever want to say that any good news because the overall picture is bleak, of course, but is there any compensating counterbalance to this?
Well, yeah, a lot of people die from cold weather, and deniers like Bohr and Romberg have made great hay with this in giving reasons for denying that climate change is dangerous, which is an absolutely atrocious thing to be doing. They're really different issues, of course. The what we're looking at is essentially global warming, increasing extreme weather events as I've described. And I want to point out that all of these huge wealth of papers, they conclude that all of these global warming climate change effects on infectious and vector-borne diseases, they are going to happen. They've started to happen, and they're going to happen more and more and more. Now, to me, that's very, very scary indeed. Tropical diseases are very nasty diseases to me. And as I think Paul pointed out, the tropics are expanding. And so we can expect in the temperate regions to get more of these really horrid, horrid diseases. The big one, of course, I suppose, is malaria. The IPCC says that for every 1 degree C above an optimum of 22.5, malaria risk increases by approximately 10%. So although, again, public health and international public health efforts have been very successful in reducing malaria and malaria deaths, we still have 600,000 people die from malaria every single year. And there's no question that that's going to increase a lot. My final point is that number one, people really should be scared about this. People don't seem to be scared about anything about climate change. That's really irrational to me. Because the other thing is that people should be realizing that, especially in this adverse, horrid political climate, our climate change, which is accelerating already, is going to accelerate faster and faster.
Well, thanks, Peter, for that. Paul, your thoughts?
I'd recommend that people have a look. It's easy to obtain the data of, we know there's over 8 billion people on the planet. And if you look at the population distribution with latitude, and then you look at the cold weather deaths. Some counter examples to more people dying from cold weather. Look at the Scandinavian countries and look at like they're generally healthy populations, and there's very, very few people that die of cold weather in those countries. I mean, it used to be, of course, if people don't have shelter from the elements. Like a lot of cold weather deaths, I think they're from people being exposed to sick people indoors. And indoor air quality is just, it's something we need to really put regulations on around the world. I think we've learned a lot from COVID, transmission indoors, people wearing masks and so on. But a very simple way to measure indoor air quality is just have a CO2 detector inside an enclosed space. So you go in a meeting room, all the doors are shut, windows are shut, 20 people in a small room around a long table. CO2 levels can rise from, 700 parts per million in that indoor environment to 3,000, 4,000 parts per million within an hour, depending on the number of people. If the room feels really stuffy, people start yawning. Any virus could be transmitted very easily amongst all those people. So a lot of the colder environments tend to have windows closed and the air is separated. So the indoor environment is a huge factor in making cold weather deaths as high as they are. So that's another issue as well. Before I forget, we're also getting marine heat waves, as Peter's mentioned that. And there's this Vibrio bacterium, which is hitting some people on coastlines. They can't go in the water. I mean, if the nature of the water changes in the ocean, I mean, the worst case is sort of going to what's called a Canfield Ocean. I recommend people have a look at what that is because that's basically a stratified ocean that's emitting toxic gases, and it's very harmful to people. And, we did have a world where there was a sort of Canfield Ocean, and this would be horrendous to human health on the planet if such a thing was ever reached again. So there's a lot of factors in it. And, when you're doing scientific research, you want to kind of isolate things and study only one variable. It's difficult to do for medical studies. I think it's notoriously difficult to do for medical studies, seeing, for example, how a pathogen affects people. And things pop up in the news. Like right now, as we're filming this, there's the hantavirus scare from cruise boats. There's the Ebola occurring in Africa. That seems to be getting worse and worse. And it wasn't that long ago. It was only when COVID started, right? 5 years ago or so, and we all lived through that. So, there's a lot of factors at play. It's very difficult to do medical research and trying to pin it to one factor because there's usually a lot of other factors that are different too. If you're studying pathogens in a human population, you have to really know a lot about the human population. One population in, say, Scandinavia is different from a population in the US. For example, you could pick it, if you're looking at people in the US that are you have to factor out all the other factors like lifestyle and obesity and general health of people and longevity and things like that. There's a lot of factors. I would say in medical research, medical paper research, often there's more conflicting results of scientific papers than there are in, say, an area of, say, pure physics, for example, because you can control the factors a lot better if it's a pure science thing that you're studying versus people and and their health and reactions to pathogens.
When there's an El Nino, the populations who are infected and affected by these diseases that we've been looking at increases dramatically. So that's not only very important for today because we're looking at this super El Nino, but it's pretty well proof positive, right? That global warming increases populations affected by these infectious diseases.
Paul, you had mentioned a term that I'd never heard of before, Canfield Oceans, with oceans boiling off, or something that really scared
Uh,
me. Can you explain to our viewers a bit more about that?
Well, the Canfield Ocean is basically, if the ocean got too stratified, since there's much less vertical movement of water, there's much less mixing, then what can happen is there's certain types of marine creatures that can proliferate and then basically emit some noxious gases. It's not the ocean's like boiling off, it's the ocean's just basically becoming dead oceans. And then all of the marine life that's in the top layer, the very warm top layer with very little mixing, it becomes stagnant and it starts emitting dangerous chemicals, which could really affect people along coastlines. I mean, it's in the paleo records. It's well documented. It's a state we just don't want to reach. So, just think of like, if you have a pond in the country and it's fed by a river, you're getting continuous water movement in and out of the pond. You can have a very healthy life in the pond. But if you've got a stagnant pond where the water's not moving much, it pretty much is horrible and stinks and you get ammonia produced and it can be very harmful to people in the region if it's stagnant water. So that's the sort of idea, there were times in the past when the ocean had much less mixing. That's the term that people have used, Canfield Ocean. It might be worth doing a whole program on it at some point if we're talking about times in the past from the paleo records, periods of the earth that weren't so conducive to supporting life.
But I mean, you painted a very stark picture of what the oceans might become. But is there any evidence that we're anywhere near reaching what you're describing, or is this largely a historical event or set of events and maybe an absolute worst case scenario?
There are some regions down in the Gulf of Mexico where, the Mississippi River runs in and if the river's laden with nutrients and you get a proliferation of phytoplankton bloom and then there's not enough marine life to ingest the phytoplankton, then it can basically rot and decay and sink to the bottom and it can basically make that region of water dead. I mean, if that sort of thing expanded to many other places, with incredible warming, continuing, then it's just another risk. It's a long shot. I mean,
I think
somebody shouldn't
it's
go and worry about Canfield Oceans right now.
Well,
I
that's
just
what I
think,
wanted to make sure
yeah,
that
yeah, yeah,
this
no,
is
it's
not something to wake up tomorrow over breakfast
yeah,
and tell your spouse or your kids
no, 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 not
about.
nothing.
You got to listen to this guy Paul talking about Canfield. And let me, as we turn to
Yeah.
the last portion of the program, I want to ask Peter and then Paul. Let's switch over to how can society in general and the public health community, the medical community in particular, address these emerging threats. We're not helpless. Human beings have adapted to a disease and epidemics throughout our history, including COVID. What's your perspective, Peter, as somebody who's looked at this issue for many years?
Well, as I say, the link is with increasing extreme weather events. Now, the response to extreme weather events obviously is immediate decline of global emissions, such as the IPCC has said. But the other big thing is that public health and disaster response services everywhere. Now, I'm not just talking about the poorer countries, I'm talking about the richer countries as well. They have to be greatly upgraded, right? Because we're really looking at, I mean, you could call it an infectious disease bomb that we're looking at. I mean, all of these risk factors are well known. They're all increasing, and they're increasing at an accelerating rate. Now, so that's what we've got to do, and that means pouring money and resources into this. Unfortunately, tragically, just the opposite is happening right now. We're backing off resources to disasters and public health.
Paul, your perspective, how do we respond? What should we be doing that we're not doing? Is there anything that you feel is in particular is being overlooked?
I'll start with at the individual level. Personal hygiene habits are vital for not exposing yourself to viruses and bacteria. So, the most important thing you can ever do is if you ever use, when you use a public washroom, you need to wash your hands thoroughly, and some decent soap, right? And then when you leave the washroom, you're touching the door handle. Well, the door handle could be laden with bacteria and stuff on it. Some of this stuff can live on stainless steel or metal surfaces for days, like hantavirus apparently can live on a surface. And why was it transmitted in a cruise ship? Well, you can see people are confined. So there's certain personal things that one can do. And another thing is, one of the habits we often have is we put our hands up to our face. Whenever you do that, move your hand away and consciously think, I'm going to break this habit. I'm never going to put my hand up to my mouth or my nose, right? That could, be a huge thing to reduce the transmission of disease vectors because often we're touching things as we go throughout our day and then we put our hands up and this is how we get a flu or a virus or a cold even or something much worse, right? So you can actually train yourself to try to not do this. And these are simple things. I'm talking about an individual. So if kids learn how to do this and people in schools and that you get lifetime habits of not doing this, those things, if a large number of people are doing acting that way, that can make a big difference on transmission. I mean, maybe some people get too paranoid too. I mean, there's still people walking around I tell people I've lost some friends to COVID because they don't want to go in any public space anymore and they wear masks all the time. I've got a few friends like that. That's kind of overdoing it. What kind of a life do you have if you don't see your friends or, you can't go out in public and because you're worried about other things coming from COVID, right? So you don't want to overdo it. There's a balance there. But I think if people stop putting their hands up to their noses and mouths, I think disease transmission would go way, way down in our overall population.
Okay, that's very interesting and something that I think very few people know. That's just their personal habits. I'm wondering how many times I put my hands up to my face just during this program, or now avoiding doing that. Thank you for that, Paul. And let me add my own editorial comment. I'm actually writing a book on the health benefits of light, and they are remarkable, the emerging research. And so, what I would say to people is spend as much time outdoors, particularly in the morning. Morning sun is incredibly therapeutic, and it's much more important to get morning sun in the winter than it is in the summer. The benefits are even greater. Plus, you're getting out of that stagnant air with the toxins that Paul talked about earlier. It's one of those what's often called no regrets. Because at worst, you'll feel better, you'll enjoy it, you'll take a walk, hang out with your friends or your family in the morning, and that you'll probably find that both you and those around you will be healthier in all sorts of ways. So, with that, I want to thank Paul and Peter. We've touched on a whole variety of issues, everything from the seas potentially getting more gaseous to don't touch your nose to everything in the middle, and Peter's multiple years of looking at this issue and your reminder, there's such a critical reminder, even though it won't have an instant effect, but ultimately emissions have to be controlled. As long as we continue to avoid doing that, then all of these conditions will be getting worse, and we're going to have to be scurrying around in ways we haven't even thought about to more effectively adopt to conditions we shouldn't have to adapt. So thank you again, Peter. Thank you again, Paul. And now, as we do every week, I'm going to talk about the climate three of the bigger, if not biggest, stories on climate change the past week, each in 1 minute or less. First, latest statistics on coal plants. We know coal is is the dirtiest of all fuels, contributes the most to climate change per unit. And yet coal plants have hit a 10-year high in terms of new construction last year. I was floored when I read this. The world added nearly 100 gigawatts of new coal capacity, the equivalent of 100 large coal plants, according to the latest annual report from the Global Energy Monitor. The good news, if you want to call it that, or the less bad news, is that they're generating less electricity for a variety of reasons than one would expect. And 95% of these coal plants come from two countries, and just two countries, India and China. Story number two, we've talked before, we've had Dan Galpern, the attorney and human rights activist, talk about the really important decision that the World Court made last year, saying that countries have an obligation to act on climate change. Well, just very recently, within the last couple of days, the United Nations has adopted a resolution backing that opinion, stating that countries have a legal obligation to address climate change. 141 countries voted in favor of the resolution, and only 8 countries were against it. There are also 28 abstentions, including, interestingly, India and Turkey, who's the host of COP31. So here we have a country hosting COP31 that's not even voting in favor of addressing climate change. And I think it's also important to highlight those 8 countries. First one won't surprise any of us, the United States, but also Israel, Russia, Belarus, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Liberia, and Iran. And so we have at least one thing in common between two countries that are at war, the United States and Iran. They're both against climate change. And interestingly, I happened to see a statistic in the same vein. There are now 140 countries in the world that have net zero targets for greenhouse gases. 140. They're among the major emitters, the larger countries. There are only 2 countries in the world that do not have net zero targets, and they are the United States and Iran. So it looks like we have more in common with our enemy than with our friends here in the United States. And the last thing, very briefly, and following on what we said earlier, a study just came out in Brazil showing some 60,000 excess deaths from respiratory diseases as a result of abnormal temperatures. About 1/3 of those coming from people in cold areas of Brazil, in those parts of the country, and 2/3 from parts of Brazil that have excess heat. So this is 66,000 people from temperatures that are not conducive to human survival. So it just illustrates the magnitude of what we've talked about earlier in the program. With that, as always, I want to thank you. Thanks to our guest panelists today, Peter and Paul, and I hope you'll like, subscribe to the channel, and as always, we will see you next week. Goodbye.